The DS and the PSP, these were two massive handhelds if you look down the history of units sold. Combined in their generation, they sold over 230 million units. Obviously lopsided towards the DS, or what you're seeing here is the DS Lite. But still, 80 million for the PSP, 150 or so million for the DS. There's some pretty good sales here. I want to do videos covering both of these, and we're going to be doing that. Today we're going to start with the DS, or well, the one I was most familiar with, the DS Lite.
The year was 2003, and unless you wanted to become a professional in Snake on your Nokia 1100, or you were one of the few people who signed a contract for an N-Gage, you were probably playing on a Game Boy Advance. At this point, Nintendo had dominated the handheld market, steamrolling competitors like Sega and Atari. While the console side of the company was having a much harder time against this competition, the Game Boy line had seen little to no opposition, riding high on the insanity that was Pokemon. Nintendo felt literally invincible and unchallenged in this space, at least until E3 of that year when Sony took everyone by surprise.
There's going to be a new baby within the family. It's not a PlayStation 3. Okay. Sony Computer Entertainment will be launching new handheld entertainment platform in 2004. The name of this new platform is called PSP. Yes, PlayStation Portable.
Side note, do you want to feel old for a second? This is the same E3 that Half-Life 2 and Doom 3 were shown off to the public. Nintendo was stunned and seemingly caught off guard by Sony. See, the first Game Boy had a long shelf life, nearly 10 years, and it seemed Nintendo was going to walk the same path with the Game Boy Advanced. At the time, competition with N-Gage was doing nothing to push Nintendo forward. Here's one of Nokia's big reveals actually at E3 for their N-Gage system. The N-Gage was shown to be $299 to absolutely no applause. Don't worry though, Nokia had a backup plan. Just in case people in the crowd weren't interested, they had a girl run out into the crowd with $299 painted on her stomach.
For starters, talking on the N-Gage like it was a telephone requires you to do this. Hold it up to your phone like this, the earpiece right here, microphone down here. Now this is sort of like holding a Choco Taco up to your head. I don't know if you've ever done that.
Yeah, Nintendo wasn't too worried about the N-Gage. But now things were different. Sony had already taken over Nintendo's space in the console market in a similar fashion with the surprise announcements at an earlier launch. Nintendo certainly woke up that day from cruise control after Sony's bombshell announcement. Little did Sony know, however, Nintendo had been working on an idea for the next handheld system, one that would change the way we look at handhelds going forward. Nintendo wasn't going to let their stranglehold in the handheld market go without a fight, and in order to combat Sony, they were going to have to pull from an idea that Nintendo had created nearly 2 decades earlier. Only a few months later, in November, Nintendo announced it was working on a new system that would strangely not succeed the Game Boy Advance or GameCube. I say strangely because we of course know at this time that the DS did in fact succeed the Game Boy Advance and had the ability to even play Game Boy Advance games. Fast forward to E3 the following year in 2004, and both the DS and PSP were announced at each company's conference. Side note, do you know how we can tell this was 2004? This is the reaction Wi-Fi received from the crowd.
But what if your friend is more than a few feet away, say a few time zones away? No problem. Wi-Fi means you can connect via the net. It's beyond online, it's no line.
With what we know now with the DS Lite, the original DS wasn't much to look at. It felt large and the screens were dim, but it sold tremendously well when it launched and quickly outpaced the PSP 2-to-1 right out of the gate. Nintendo was smart about their pricing at a $149 entry point that was at a minimum $50 cheaper than the PSP. Furthermore, the idea of the DS was mind-blowing, having 2 screens that could interact in different ways with each other, and the player opened the door to some amazing possibilities in games. Nintendo had actually come up with the idea of a two-screen system in 1982 with the Game & Watch multi-screen system. The DS actually paid homage to the device as well as one of the greatest minds in gaming, the late Gunpei Yokoi, who is said to have created the Game & Watch line after seeing a bored businessman playing on a calculator one day. Think about that for a minute. Gunpei's ideas were so ahead of their time that even 20 years later, our minds were being blown by his crazy designs. Couple that with the clever backwards compatibility for Game Boy Advance games, and the system immediately had a large library day one. In the first 2 months on the market, the DS had accrued 2.8 million units sold, and from there, no one could stop Nintendo, and the DS Lite revision would only work to catapult the system further. In March of 2006, just 14 months after the initial launch of the DS Lite was released. This new revision fixed a lot of complaints about the older one, including a slimmer, sleeker profile, much brighter screens, and improved battery life. This is considered by many as one of the best revisions of any system to date. The demand for this newly revised DS was out of control. Nintendo could not keep this system in stock despite shipping larger and larger orders. The handhelds would constantly sell out. Nintendo released 550,000 units during the launch in March, but the system immediately sold out. So the following month, Nintendo upped to 700,000 units in April, but it still sold out. The shortage would last worldwide over the course of 2006 and midway through 2007. Nintendo just could not make enough DS Lite systems to meet demand. So what exactly made the DS Lite work so well and become one of the best-selling revisions in history? For that, we should take it apart. I think looking at the system, you can really get a feel for how much better it is in the hands than the original DS. Seriously, if you used a DS Lite for an extended period of time and then try to go back to the original DS, it just feels archaic, almost like an entire generational leap on build quality and feel alone. And yes, of course, Nintendo uses those annoying tri-tip screws on this system, so we need to remove those and then the Phillips head screws under the door. The nice thing about the DS Lite is once you remove the backing, you're looking directly at the motherboard. In fact, with just a few more screws, the entire thing comes right out. The biggest pain about the system is by far the antenna cable that runs underneath the game slot. I guess this was the best route they could come up with when assembling it, but getting the cable back underneath of this slot was the most annoying part when putting the system back together. Generally, I would have a reflow station set up to remove something with multiple service-mounted solder points. For this project, I don't have access to one currently, so I'll be using just a standard heat gun to slowly heat up the points and remove it that way. I'm also not going to be using a good working board for this. Instead, I have some scrap boards left over from the old stores that I would work at, and I'm just going to pull it off of there so you can take a look at it, since in this environment using a heat gun, there's way too much that can go wrong. With the card slot removed, we can see the CPU and coprocessor. Nintendo opted for 2 different chips to be placed under the card slot in order to use the metal and plastic housing as a heatsink for the chips. It was a good idea as a design and uses the card slot in a clever way to cool the chips. Now looking at the processors, we have 2, with the main chip being an ARM 946ES and the other chip being an ARM 7 TDMI. The ARM 7 helps provide support for playing Game Boy Advance games, along with the sound processing in DS games. The ARM 9 is set up as the system's main processor, covering main gaming duties around running games and video rendering. The chips are paired with 4 megabytes of system memory. There are still arguments going on to this day about how powerful the DS was, but many people place it around the N64 and PS1 generation of consoles during those comparisons.
As for the top screen, there's really not a lot going on here. It's actually pretty simple and pretty basic, actually. Now, it got a lot worse when they went to the 3DS, even the DSi when they started introducing cameras, but this is a very straightforward design. We have 2 cables, mostly for antennas, and then we have 1 cable for the screen. So not a lot going on there. In fact, if you have to ever replace the top screen for a DS Lite, the entire assembly is cheap enough now to where I recommend just buying this whole piece online, and then you just reverse and drop the board in with the buttons and you close it up. It's much, much faster. We're still gonna pull this apart though very quickly just so you can see what's inside. The way this works, there's 4 face Phillips head screws here. They come off, they're covered by these stickers, so you want to peel them off. Generally, like a nice, maybe like a nice X-Acto blade will help get those out of there, just to make it a bit easier. At that point, you can close it, and then this will actually all slide up and away from the hinge. And then you can actually open it up, and you should see your screen and speakers all running there. So let's go ahead and pop this guy out, and you should see everything right there. So it does have 2 speakers, as you can see here. there and there. They're actually soldered to this main cable here that runs down to the system board, and that's how they basically just run the speakers through that. That's why you don't have speaker cables running down through there. We have our Wi-Fi antenna there, and then we have our microphone here. So we have microphone, antenna for our Wi-Fi, speakers, and the screen. So again, it's much simpler than what we have to deal with the 3DS, DSi, any of the XLs, the 2DS XL. This was way better to work on, and I liked a lot more. The thing that I always got annoyed with was this black cable having to run it underneath that card slot. Whereas if you get the 3DS, it's a whole other thing with trying to run a bunch of cables through this hinge. But much better here, very simple. Again, not a lot to show here. It was just Nintendo redesigning and making everything simpler and most likely cheaper. Now the DS Lite actually had pretty good build quality. The only issue was the hinge on the side would kind of break and spin at times. This would basically not have a nice click to it. You can also replace that. Again, you can also order the entire assembly on the top and pretty much just replace it that way. That saves you a lot of time. It's worth the extra 10, 15 bucks to do it if you just want a really nice, clean open. But just in general, looking back at the DS Lite, it was just a well-built system. It was such a good revision. It threw everything together, better battery life, and overall, it was just good. I mean, when I compared it to, it was weird. Sony was supposed to have the more premium system, but the DS Lite felt more premium than the PSP when it came out. It was just a clamshell design, so it had the case, was essentially built in. Your screens were always protected because of that. And the PSP would get scratched constantly. You needed a nice little cloth to put on it, a nice case for it. This was just a durable, well-built system. And yeah, it's probably one of my favorite revisions ever made.
The DS line of handhelds would go on to sell an unthinkable 154 million units worldwide. It is the second best-selling system of all time behind the PS2 and is the best-selling handheld game system of all time. It's a bar that will probably never be reached again with the rise of mobile phones and tablets, but even with the absence of freemium games and time wasters, the DS achievements cannot be understated. Nowadays, it looks like dedicated handheld gaming is on its way out, with the 3DS slowing to a crawl in both new games and sales, and Sony essentially exiting the handheld market after the Vita was unable to gain any traction. The DS design continues to live on in the 3DS, and even in some respects, the Wii U, which also attempted to leverage a multi-screen setup. What the DS showed us above all else is having a great idea for a system is better than throwing all the power in the world at it. It's something that Nintendo continues to carry with them, for better or worse. Thinking outside of the box doesn't always work for Nintendo, and most recently, it downright hurt them with the Wii U. However, I do see that creative spark back with Nintendo with the release of the Switch, and something like Labo still shows you can never count out the creative side of the Big N. If you have never owned a DS Lite, I recommend picking one up even today. The library is vast at over 1,700 titles, and the system can be had for $50 or less, and with a battery life of 12 to 15 hours, it makes current devices look downright power hungry. I have a lot of fond memories of the DS Lite, and it's taught me one thing in particular. Never count out a long-forgotten idea from the past.